Welcome everyone to the second episode of the Students as Stakeholders podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Brogan. Almost 2 months ago in April, an incoming principal for the Pittsburgh School District in Kansas resigned following the questioning of her credentials from students at the local high school. Now, according to the Kansas City Star, the student journalist of Pittsburgh uncovered that Principal Robertson had allegedly received her master's and doctorate degree from Cortland's University, which has been referred to as a diploma mill, or a place in which people simply pay for a degree. After the high school students questioned their new principal's credentials, Robertson then told Pittsburgh School Board that she would be resigning immediately. Now, why is this case so important for student representation? I mean, this is just a small city in Kansas where the last time there was national media coverage, it was because of a fried chicken war between two establishments within the city limits. Obviously, this case had very little impact, right? Not quite. In fact, I believe this is the single biggest piece of student voice so far in 2017, and yet, I think this amazing story largely went under the radar for mainstream media. Now, consider what the implicit story is behind the news itself here. This principal had to go through a vetting process both by the high school and the school board. She then must have gone through an extensive interview and also would have presented a resume and her previous experience, which, in all fairness, Robertson had experience in leadership, in education consultation, and also working in Dubai. Without a tinge of doubt, this hiring process included extensive background checks, references, and interviews to ensure she was the right fit for this position. Yet, the students at Pittsburgh wanted to inquire about her previous education, a line of questioning that would be absolutely fair and appropriate for any district to ask. Consider the fact that when students received their answer from Robertson, they were determined to analyze her background to ensure that Robertson would be able to work with the students, since an undeniable component to being a principal is working with the student body. This is when the students became incredulous with Robertson's higher educational experience. There are two key things we should consider here. The first is that Robertson certainly had experience with leadership and management for education, but more importantly, some of her qualifications were not considered completely legitimate, and we expect our students to be open and honest with their work, and in this case, it was the students that got a principal who was not being entirely honest about her qualifications. This resignation likely saved the school from having a potentially tarnished reputation, and it wasn't because of an administration that has decades of experience in education, but rather, it was the power of the student body. Now, isn't that unbelievably powerful? No, it's more than powerful. We just witnessed student empowerment. A group of students proved to be so invaluable in their research that they showed greater diligence than the school board. Now, I want to be clear here. I believe the school board and district as a whole is completely competent and dealt with this situation with maturity and professionalism. And kudos to this district for thanking the students. When students are encouraged and respected as stakeholders, this is the positive ending that we see when there's collaboration and respect amongst all stakeholders. Sadly, this is rarely the case in most states across the country, as students aren't always seen as equals in the discussion of educational issues. That being said, in the short span of a century, America has gone from having 0 students sitting at the table with other stakeholders to a nation where nearly half of the states at least have created laws that allow students to be on school boards, state boards, and or advise state legislatures. Now, as an avid history buff here, I've never heard about how student representation expanded significantly within the 20th and 21st centuries. It is a proud part of our shared history that has been ignored. That is why we will be going over the brief but essential history of America's relationship with student representatives in this week's podcast. Before diving into the nitty-gritty here, let's give ourselves a frame of reference for what we will consider student representation. Because depending on how one wants to define student representation, there could be a multitude of starting dates. So let us define student representation as cases in which students in grades K through 12 have demonstrated levels of leadership which have led to change in local, state, or federal policy and or legislation. Now, to clean this up a little more here, we will break this into 4 categories. Students being agents of change for schools, for boards of education, for state legislatures, and also for federal policy. As a final note, there are so many instances of student representation that could not possibly be put into a single episode. So I've tried to condense the most wide-reaching events without undermining or disrespecting those who have made vast changes. There will be future episodes for these kind of details. I promise that. Now that we have a frame of reference, we can now launch ourselves all the way back to 1927. At this point, our president is Calvin Coolidge. The Roaring Twenties are in full swing, and less than a decade prior, women finally were allowed to vote in federal elections, thanks to the implementation of the 19th Amendment. We're forgetting something else in this decade of American Renaissance, though. The birth of student governments, of course. In 1927, the first interscholastic conference of student councils was held at New Brunswick High School in New Jersey, where high school students from various high schools within the state worked together on leadership training and working with school boards, faculty, and staff back at their schools to improve the educational experience within the entire state of New Jersey. The official name of this organization is now known as the New Jersey Association of Student Councils, and during the first half of the 20th century, one of their most impressive feats was raising war bonds during World War II. In fact, they raised so much money that they were able to purchase a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress for the war efforts. The aptly named Spirit of New Jersey Youth cost about $240,000 in 1943. But I don't think we can truthfully appreciate that value without calculating it for its inflation. $240,000 US from 1943 would be worth about a staggering $3.4 million in 2017. That is an incredible amount of fundraising for Allied forces done by the high school students of New Jersey. Since its inception, the New Jersey Association of Student Councils has done tremendous work in community outreach and leadership that has vastly improved the quality of education within New Jersey. Now, since the nascency of our first Association of Student Councils, we now see quite a majority of states have some form of statewide student councils that work on student rights, leadership training, and building relationships with other stakeholders. But now, we fast forward to exactly 30 years later in the year of 1957. Elvis recently premiered on The Ed Sullivan Show. The Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite into space, and America is suffering from racial discrimination. But before we go right into 1957, let us go back a couple years earlier as a preface. In 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education is passed by the Supreme Court, which was a federal mandate to ensure that all students, regardless of race, received the same quality of education. This landmark Supreme Court decision also ruled an end to segregated schooling. But in reality, states and towns refused to change their policy of segregated schools for years to come. The year 1957 will change the way our schools look forever. And this year was single-handedly one of the most important years for education in America, if not the most important, due to the shockwave that was felt across the world. We now see ourselves at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, a state in which Governor Faubus has refused to have integration within public schools. His unlawful policy sparked ire and outrage in many across the country. But others also supported his stance on states' rights. Governor Faubus at the time was by far the most controversial governor of the 20th century, and today he is recognized as one of the worst governors in terms of the preservation of human rights and civil rights. But we now turn to the 9 brave students of color who are demanding their right to quality education. These 9 students were Ernest Green, Elizabeth Eckford, Jefferson Thomas, Terrence Roberts, Carlotta Walls Lanier, Menijan Brown, Gloria Ray Karlmark, Thelma Mothershed, and Melba Patio Beals. And they decided, after consultation with civil rights leaders, to protest the governor and enter Central High School, an all-white school at the time. This decision caused massive protests and violence to the point in which then-President Eisenhower ordered the National Guard to enter Arkansas. The level of protest and disruption caused by 9 students of color who desired equal access to quality education put enormous pressure on Faubus, as well as the federal government putting military pressure on his state. These 2 factors forced Faubus to end his policy of segregated schools in Arkansas, following a conference with Eisenhower in Rhode Island. This moment in American civil rights is invariably one of the most profound victories for people of color in America. And deservedly so, this is seen as a civil rights issue. But it is rarely seen as a monumental leap forward for demonstrating the power of students and what they are capable of accomplishing if they are empowered to become leaders. For those that do not think the youth can make substantial differences in our world are without a doubt wrong in their beliefs. 9 students of color changed the world in 1957 because they were determined to have equal access to education, which has been deemed a right in America. These students saw that the degradation of human rights was transpiring in front of their eyes, and they were brave enough to stand up for what was right, and they were victorious despite the insurmountable odds against them in an institution that has systematically oppressed marginalized communities within the United States of America. We now travel to a new decade, the year 1971. America is deeply divided over the prolonged war with Vietnam, but yet our planet reached a collective milestone only 2 years earlier by putting 2 humans on the moon, a feat that could not possibly be overstated. We also see that the late 60s and 70s brings us in the middle of a liberal movement in which rights are being expanded to countless citizens. This includes lowering the voting age to 18, as well as the promulgation of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. We find ourselves, though, in Massachusetts, where Governor Francis W. Sargent has just signed a bill into law that will change the course of American education. The law is twofold. Firstly, he has now created the first ever student advisory council that is meant to have high school students present information and concerns from the perspective of students within the Commonwealth. The second component to this legislation was Governor Sargent creating a new position on the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. This position would be a democratically elected student who would also act as the chairperson of the state student advisory council. This chairperson would also become the first voting student representative sitting on a state board, or anywhere for that matter. In response to this legislation, Sargent stated that, quote, "If we are to replace confrontation with deliberation and shouting with dialogue, youth must be invited in, not shut out. We have a climate where young and old can sit together, talk, and listen," unquote. Since its creation, the State Student Advisory Council and the student representative ensured that marginalized communities are protected due to the anti-discrimination laws of 1993. They also helped create the first Student Bill of Rights, and more recently, ensured that students had a say in the educator evaluation process, where educators would actually be partly graded on how students rated their performance as educators. Since this dramatic victory for students, there have been 3 other states that have included students with voting rights on state boards of education, as well as 18 other states that now have students sitting on state boards of education as liaisons. Though often overlooked, this is honestly one of the most defining moments for education in the 20th century, at least in my opinion. Our most recent of firsts in student representation comes to us in the 21st century. In fact, we only have to travel back 15 years to 2002. As we entered the new millennium, there was excitement through what humanity could achieve in the modern era, considering the exponential technological boom just occurred. On the other hand, the post-Soviet landscape brought geopolitical uncertainty and fear into a much smaller world that still persists today. We do, however, achieve a beacon of hope for student representation as Maine becomes the first state to establish a youth legislative advisory council. The group of high school students gather from all regions of the state to develop legislative ideas that they annually present to the state legislature. One of the most noteworthy accomplishments created by the students was a bill that would grant siblings custody rights if siblings were separated due to a divorce in the year of 2006. Since 2002, many other states have legally established some type of legislative council for high school students in order to be civically engaged and have a say in their government despite not being able to vote. I can't stress enough, this was simply a brief history of student representation, as there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases in which students have made tangible changes in law or policy. But I did not feel it was appropriate to condense it into a single episode. This is instead meant to be a stepping stone to see how student representation has grown and evolved over the last century, since no other place has tried to make a chronology of student representation, at least to my knowledge through research. As we come to an end of our podcast, let's first take a look at our exit card. Students have and will continue to make a meaningful difference as long as we provide an environment that allows them to be the catalyst for change. Students have demonstrated incredible thoughtfulness and maturity that is equal to other stakeholders. For policymakers and legislators that still doubt how much students have changed the face of education, they might want to reconsider why they are working in the field of education. There is incontrovertible evidence that students have changed the course of human history for the better, and it's high time we recognize their contributions to society. I hope you all enjoyed this week's conversation. Tune in next week for more powerful discussions. I'm your host, Daniel Brogan, wishing you the best.